From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Friends, old and new, many new faces, many old friends who have been here since the start of the Vardanants lecture. Welcome to the 19th, a truly astounding number to me, 19th Vardanants Day Armenian lecture. We have a very rich program today, but before we start, I'd like to welcome several people who I think highly of and who are so important to not only the Library of Congress, but to the Armenian programs at the Library of Congress. First and foremost, Dr. James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, and Mrs. Billington. We're very honored to have you here today. I am very happy to greet yet again Dr. Vartan Gregorian, President of the Carnegie Endowment, the Carnegie Corporation, and Dr. Gregorian opened our exhibit 3 years ago with a magnificent lecture. So, Dr. Gregorian, thank you so much. And a dear friend, both of the Library of Congress and of Armenia, and to me, His Excellency John Evans, former ambassador to the Republic of Armenia. Last, but certainly not least, I also wish to greet those who have traveled from near and far to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, to participate in the events associated with the centennial of the Armenian genocide. Welcome to you all. I truly mean that. But I have to mention another person. I would like to, with profound sadness, note the absence of a very special person, His Excellency Harry Gilmore, the first United States ambassador to the Republic of Armenia. Harry was a friend and a supporter of all our programs and was one of the earliest of the Vardanants lecturers when he talked about his experience in Armenia, and then he joined 4 others, or the first 5 ambassadors to Armenia, in a very special program, a conversation with the first 5 ambassadors. I'm sorry to report that Harry passed away on April 23rd. He will be sorely missed, but it is fitting that we dedicate this 19th lecture in the long series to his very distinguished memory. Now, I would like to introduce a person without whose active and sincere support our exhibits, our lectures, and our displays would never have happened. Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, the Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Dr. Deeb.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's really, a joy to see so many people coming and attending this very, very special program. So I want to say that on behalf of Dr. Billington, the Librarian of Congress, Mrs. Billington, and all the staff of the African and Middle Eastern Division, I would like to welcome you here today in this beautiful room, a fitting place for the program we're looking forward to hear. I too would like to add my thanks to Dr. Levon Avdoyan's and to thank those of you who have come from various parts of the United States to be part of this program, to join us. Thank you, Dr. Vartan Gregorian, for being here, and thank you, Ambassador Evans, also for having come, and thank you all for your presence. Let me tell you a little bit about our division, where this very important collection of Armenian books, serials, manuscripts can be found. Armenian films, photographs, music, maps, and other items are spread throughout this vast library. but I can only speak about my own division, and so I'm going to show off a little bit. It's made up of 3 sections, the African, the Near East, and the Hebraic sections. We are responsible for materials from 78 different countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as the entire continent of Africa, North and Sub-Sahara. Our Hebraica and Judaica collections come from all over the world. We also serve these materials to patrons in our reading rooms and organize programs, exhibits, conferences, and other activities that highlight our collections and that inform our patrons about the countries and the cultures these publications come from. The librarians in this division, as well as in many others, are themselves published scholars with a deep knowledge of the languages, the history, and the cultures of the countries whose collections they're responsible for. A case in point is our own Armenian and Georgian specialist, Dr. Levon Avdoyan. And let's give him a hand. Dr. Avdoyan holds an MA and MPhil and a PhD in ancient history with a minor in Armenian history and civilization from Columbia University. And he has worked with renowned scholars of ancient history and of Armenian and Byzantine history, such as Professors Morton Smith and Nina Garsoyan. After a year as a fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, the Center for Byzantine Studies in Washington, he joined the Library of Congress in 1976. He became a specialist for classics, ancient history, and Byzantine and medieval studies in the main reading room in 1982, and the Armenian and Georgian specialist in the Near East section of African and Middle Eastern Division in 1992. In 2012, he curated an exhibit for the 500th anniversary of the first printed Armenian book, which drew close to 250,000 people. The catalog in English was translated to Armenian, and an electronic edition is being discussed. He has published and spoken widely both on ancient and medieval Armenia and on its neighbors. And so I will leave Dr. Avdoyan to introduce our speaker today. Lee?
Thank you, Mary Jane. Just a sideline, an addendum to the exhibit of 2012. If I can convince you to come to the display tomorrow, you will see a book published in 1496, which is the first time the Armenian alphabet appeared in a published work. So I hope that's an inducement. Thank you. In 1991, Mrs. Marjorie Dadian gave a generous grant to the library for the health and maintenance of the Armenian collections. From that donation came the area specialist position that I now occupy and this lecture series, which she thoroughly enjoyed until her untimely death. She also approved of an annual report I gave at that time, and I now give in an abbreviated form to share only highlights of the last year in the Armenian collections. I'm pleased to report that those collections have grown both in contemporary works and of all kinds of works, including rare Armenian and Armeno-Turkish rarities. My colleague in our acquisitions unit, Dr. Paul Krigo, who is here with us, and I have been working closely to augment our collections, along with the Cairo Overseas Office, which gathers materials for us from the lands of the Middle East. Tomorrow, we are having a display of 78 items in this very room from 10:30 to 12. And I just mentioned 2 that were recently acquired. An Armeno-Turkish memoir written by Bohos Karapetyan from Arapgir in 1848. He served the Khedive of Cairo, and he appended an Armenian genealogy of his family in Arapgir. And a curiosity, a cookbook written by one Tigran Jamgocham, which is very interesting because Tigran was a cook in the Turkish army. He deserted in 1918 and began to write down all his recipes proudly in 1920. I also want to briefly mention a journey I took to Armenia last October. There was an abbreviated one, no thanks to Air France and its pilot strike. There I participated and gave papers at several conferences, but there is one in particular I wish to share, and that was the Third International Conference of Armenian Librarians, hosted by the Armenian National Library and by Nerses Haydarpetyan, our great friend who created the Armenian Library Association there. If any group has shown courage and tenacity since the independence of Armenia, it's the librarians. It's been a pleasure to work with them, and also productive, because talks with those librarians led to their active participation of the National Library of Armenia in the World Digital Library. John Van Oudenaar is here, who directs it. That's an initiative between the Library of Congress and UNESCO. And I hasten to add that items that appeared in our exhibit, which Mary Jane mentioned, To Know Wisdom and Instruction, are at this very moment being digitized and will appear in the World Digital Library soon. And I end this brief report by stating that we are not acquiring these materials so that they sit moldy and dusty on a shelf. I therefore invite each and every one of you to make active use of these collections, which have grown in the 22 years. We've had a specialist from some 7,000 items to now over 47,000 items. And now on to our program. From the very start of my deliberations about the 19th lecture or event in this series, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind whom I wished to invite to be our speaker today. And I am gratified, we are gratified, that she readily accepted. I had heard Susan Harper deliver a truly brilliant and moving lecture on Mary Grafham, an American missionary to the late Ottoman Armenians. Rather than concentrate on the genocide, the massacres, the deportations, and the casualties of the Armenians, the massacres, the deportations of the Assyrians, the Pontic Greeks, and the Muslim populations, and all those affected by the insanity of warfare, I wanted someone who could lead an exploration of one of the, if not the first examples of American humanitarianism. Now, your program provides a fairly extensive biography of Dr. Harper, but I just want to point out that she received her degrees from Yale University and then went on to attend Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. She has served several positions at the Pew Charitable Trusts in institutional planning, the executive office, and religious scholarship. In addition to her article on Mary Grafham, she has also published a biography of the first South Asian bishop of the Anglican Church, V.S. Azaria of Dornakal. Her exploration of today's topic has led her to be named as a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. On a personal note, I have greatly enjoyed our discussions to date on this historical yet very emotional topic. Her calm yet focused study of the wealth of materials she has already seen have led her to some cogent conclusions and avenues for future research. Please join me now in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Susan B. Harper, who will speak to us about American humanitarianism in the Armenian Crucible, 1915 to 1923.
Thank you, Doctors of Doyen and Deeb, for your kind words. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm grateful to you and to the Library of Congress for hosting this event. I owe special thanks to the Carnegie Corporation and its president, Dr. Vartan Gregorian, for its generous support of my work. Thank you. Vardanants Day commemorates Armenia's long struggle against forces of assimilation. On the 100th anniversary of Armenia's tragic encounter with more modern forces of annihilation, it's a special privilege to share some of my findings from research into Armenia's philanthropic response. On February 16th, 1919, 250 American humanitarian workers left New York Harbor on the SS Leviathan, bound for Constantinople via France. Only recently scrubbed of wartime camouflage, this massive ship carried its aid workers to Brest, where they transferred by train to Marseille. This was the vanguard of an American philanthropic movement shortly to become known by an act of Congress as Near East Relief. In Marseille, they boarded this British hospital ship, Gloucester Castle, in their Near East Relief uniforms for transport to Constantinople. Among them were doctors, nurses, teachers, agricultural experts, missionaries, and journalists. They arrived in the Ottoman capital 20 days after leaving New York and were soon dispersed to different corners of Asia Minor, Armenia, Syria, and the Caucasus. Here they began to dispense $3.5 million in shipment of food, clothing, hospital, and other equipment, worth about $48 million today. Nearly 1,000 American relief workers embarked on this overseas mission by 1924. 23 of them would die during their service abroad. Among the relief workers on the Leviathan and Gloucester Castle was a doctor from Benton Harbor, Michigan, named Mabel Elliott. Born in 1881, Elliott was the daughter of a soldier and one of the first women graduates of Rush Medical College, which was then a part of the University of Chicago. At the start of the war, she was a licensed physician in the state of Illinois. Now, at the war's end, she was newly certified to work for Near East Relief by a partner organization, American Women's Hospitals, or AWH, as her uniform smartly advertised. Elliott and her colleagues were answering a call to help save Near Eastern populations from what has been called a humanitarian disaster of world proportions. From 1914 to 1923, a quarter of the Ottoman Empire's inhabitants died of famine, disease, and state violence. Untold more were forced from their homes, property, and livelihoods. The state-sponsored massacres and deportations that led to the deaths of an estimated 1.5 million Armenians, the events historians now recognize as genocide, had especially gripped the American heart. Mabel Elliott and her uniformed shipmates went to the Near East principally to relieve the plight of the starving Armenians. The case for the American humanitarian response to the Armenian genocide was made first in 1915 by U.S. Ambassador to Constantinople, Henry Morgenthau. He sent urgent reports to the State Department about what he described as a campaign of race extermination against peaceful Armenians under the pretext of reprisal for rebellion. In this September 3rd, 1915 telegram, Morgenthau wrote that the destruction of the Armenian race in Turkey is progressing rapidly. He believed that these massacres and deportations could be stopped only by force, but that America, still a neutral observer of the World War, would not be willing to provide it. So he asked prominent friends to raise support for Armenian relief and immigration to America. Industrialist Cleveland Dodge, pictured right here in the front row, second from left, took up Morgenthau's challenge. And by the way, Morgenthau is seated right there to the left of Dodge. On September 16th, Dodge formed a volunteer committee for Armenian relief in New York. Within a month, it cabled its first $100,000, worth about $2.4 million today, to Constantinople. At that time, 200 congregational missionaries of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or ABCFM, supervised 21 mission stations, 7 colleges, 9 hospitals, and over 400 schools in Asiatic Turkey. Morgenthau worked with these ABCFM missionaries, American consuls, and influential independent American colleges in the Near East to begin dispensing aid to Armenian refugees and orphans. James Barton, who's seated right here to the right of Dodge, was a former educational missionary to Turkey, and he became one of the chief architects of Near East relief. After the September 16th meeting, Barton traveled to Washington to examine State Department communications about the developing Armenian catastrophe. These reports, he wrote, far surpassed anything that had been imagined. Races were in danger of annihilation, and women and children by the hundreds of thousands were face to face with death through exposure to the elements and lack of food. Within 9 months, Barton and Dodge's Central Committee launched 38 local chapters in 16 states to raise both awareness of the Armenians' plight and funds to help them. Soon it merged with related efforts for Syria, Palestine, and Persia, and it partnered with similar movements internationally. Over the next 5 years, the Near East Relief movement generated unprecedented sympathy and support through an advertising and fundraising campaign that was sophisticated, even by comparison with Herbert Hoover's larger official aid program for starving Belgians and later Russians. Near East Relief first provided information to reporters. In 1915, the New York Times published 145 articles about massacres and forced deportations of Armenians, and this one ran on December 15th. Iconic Near East Relief posters, such as these from the Library of Congress collections, promoted ambitious fundraising goals. President Wilson appealed to Americans to contribute on specially designated national days. The 1916 Yale-Harvard game proceeds went to Near East Relief. That's moving. Orphan adoption coupon books raised funds $1 at a time, claiming that each dollar would extend the life of one Armenian child for a week. And of course, $1 was still really worth something then. A 1915 dollar was worth $24 today. At the war's end, it was still worth almost $16 in today's money. Even pennies were still worth something, and penny drives also helped support the effort. Near East Relief developed some of the first child sponsorship programs. Volunteers collected bundles of clothing for orphans and refugees, and when these were shipped abroad, they are also bartered for local livestock, butter, eggs, and hay to supplement relief supplies. American farmers were challenged to fill large sacks of grain for the cause. Hollywood child celebrity Jackie Coogan led milk collection drives. Children paid for movie tickets with cans of evaporated milk. These were transported by a highly publicized national milk train and a food ship. The film Alice in Hungerland brought the plight of Armenians to life on big screens around the country. In this adaptation of Lewis Carroll's story, the American Alice travels with her father, a Near East relief worker, to see the hardships of Armenian orphans for herself. The more sensational Hollywood movie Ravished Armenia reenacted the tragic life of rescued orphan Aurora Mardiganian. She, unfortunately, had the dubious honor of starring in the movie, whose scenes of violence and torture were so graphic that they caused problems with home-based censors. Golden Rule dinners raised awareness and funds by serving simple orphanage meals. This one attracted 1,500 guests to New York City's 69th Regiment Armory. By 1926, organizations representing over 73 million Americans supported Golden Rule events. This at a time when the total population of the country was just over 117 million. A monthly journal called The New Near East described not only short-term emergency aid, but also longer-term assistance based on progressive American principles of education, health, economic development, and social relations. Donations would build a whole new society, a new Near East, it suggested. All these appeal for support paid off. The Committee on Armenian and then also Syrian Relief raised $2 million per year in 1916 and 17, worth over $48 million today. It raised $7 million in 1918, worth about $110 million today. And this map shows the transnational origins and disbursements of those funds. In 1919, Near East relief receipts hit a peak of almost 19.5 million, or 267 million today. This made it one of the largest and most ambitious private philanthropic efforts in the history of the world to that date. By 1930, it had raised $117 million worth of aid, worth, it's estimated, a total of over $2 billion today. Most of this aid was distributed in Near East Relief's first decade in two phases. The first phase during the World War, and the second phase immediately afterwards. These phases were each represented by remarkable American women. Mary Louise Graffam was a missionary who distributed aid during the First World War phase of Near East Relief. Born in 1871 in Monson, Maine, Graffam was educated at Oberlin College and left a teaching position at Washington's own National Cathedral School for Girls in 1901 to become an educational missionary in the Anatolian town of Sivas. During the next 20 years, she took only one trip back to America. Graffam became fluent in Armenian and Turkish, in addition to French and German. At the start of the Great War, when Ottoman forces suffered an initial defeat on the Russian front, she established the Red Crescent Hospital for Turkish officers in Erzurum. Graffam was a direct witness to the Armenian genocide. In July through August 1915, she accompanied 3,000 of the town's roughly 30,000 Armenians on the first 150 miles of a deportation before being turned back by officials. She then administered relief to refugees in Sivas until her own death in 1921. When I was at Harvard, I wrote about Mary Graffam's dramatic work in the First World War phase of Near East Relief. So today, I want to invite you to explore the second phase, the second post-armistice phase of Near East Relief through the eyes of another remarkable woman, the younger Mabel Elliott. As we've seen, she arrived in the Near East on the British hospital ship in 1919, just after the Allies had defeated the Ottoman Empire. And she left in 1923, just after the Turkish nationalists had defeated the Allies. This second phase of post-armistice relief was increasingly dispensed by shorter-term non-missionary workers like Elliott, rather than longer-term missionaries who were familiar with local languages and culture, like Mary Graffam. These second-phase humanitarians often had professional training in specialized areas of medicine, agricultural, or industry. They usually described their service in religious terms, as Elliott did, but increasingly they were no longer missionaries. The second phase represented a new, more secularized wave of American humanitarianism. When Elliott disembarked in Constantinople in March 1919, British, French, and Italian troops had also just arrived. It was barely 3 months after Woodrow Wilson's triumphal arrival at the Paris Peace Conference. The idealistic American relief workers were confident that soon both Turkish and non-Turkish people would be granted the self-government promised by Wilson's 12th point. A new day was dawning, wrote Mabel Elliott's AWH boss, Esther Lovejoy. The peace conference was in session, and we felt quite sure that we should find the world, including Russia and Turkey, ready and anxious to be made over in accordance with the plans and specifications of the experts at Versailles. Or, as Elliott wrote later with bitter regret, Americans, knowing no better, thought that the war was ended. In fact, a new and bloody interethnic war was just beginning. Contrary to expectations, the 1918 Mudros Armistice ended hostilities between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire, but it did not end fighting in the Near East. This massacre of 40 Armenians in Aleppo occurred after the armistice, and at about the time that Elliott was on the SS Leviathan. Elsewhere in the Anatolian heartland, the makings of a new war were taking shape. In September 1919, as Mary Grafham assisted post-war recovery in Sivas, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the hero of Gallipoli, was also in the same city. He's pictured here at the center during the Sivas Congress, which helped to lay the groundwork for a campaign to push Allied occupying forces and Mary Grafham's mission itself out of Asia Minor. This 1920 map provides a snapshot of Near East relief work just after Elliott's arrival and before Grafham's death. The orphanages, food and clothing distribution centers, hospitals, clinics, rescue homes, industrial development, and refugee camps are all shown in red. As you see, they occupy parts of central Anatolia, including Grafham's town of Sivas in the center. They're also clustered near major genocide deportation routes shown by the red arrows. Within the next 3 years, Mustafa Kemal's armies, with the help of Soviet Russia, would change this map entirely. Greece invaded Asia Minor with Allied blessing in May 1919. Allied indecision, weakness, and competition followed. The August 1920 Treaty of Sèvres tried to slice up former Ottoman lands and leave Armenians with an Anatolian homeland, but the treaty was stillborn. The Turks responded with a battle for national self-determination that took Western powers almost completely by surprise. Kemalist forces burst out of the Anatolian highlands, and their new capital in Ankara, which is shown here with the older name of Angora. Their policy of Turkification swept away much of the existing Near East relief work and the people it assisted. The shaded area on this map graphically represents the territories that were effectively cleared of non-Turks and the Near East relief by 1923. It essentially defines the modern nation-state of Turkey as ratified by the Treaty of Lausanne that same year. Now, as you'll notice, Armenians had no independent footprint on this map at all. As Churchill famously remarked, in the Treaty of Lausanne, which registered the final peace between Turkey and the great powers, history will search in vain for the word Armenia. Mabel Elliott's medical work accompanied military retreats on all sides of this changing landscape. In the south, from Cilicia here, where she began her work in the town of Marash, seen here directly south of Sivas, where Grafham would shortly be buried In the East, in the East, where she worked in newly Sovietized Yerevan and Alexandropol in the Eastern Circle, and in the Western Circle, where she was stationed in Izmit near Constantinople, and also in Greece. Okay. It's important to take just a minute to recognize that despite its generous philanthropy, America never sent military support to this region. The American Columbia never actually raised a sword on behalf of Near Eastern victims of ethnic violence, despite the martial imagery used in this Near East relief poster on the right. Woodrow Wilson maintained American neutrality during the worst of the Armenian genocide in 1915 and 16, even while issuing personal appeals for contributions to Near East relief. When Columbia called American soldiers to battle in April 1917, as in the poster on the left, it was not to fight on behalf of suffering Armenians. When America entered the world conflagration, it never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. This was owing in large part to the close friendship that developed between Near East Relief's chief financial backer, Cleveland Dodge, and Woodrow Wilson during their years together in this, the Princeton Class of 1879. In 1917, Dodge, with the support of James Barton, Morgenthau, and other Near East Relief leaders, persuaded his friend Wilson not to declare war against the Ottoman Turks. He argued it would cause the destruction or expropriation of America's mission property and independent colleges, that it would end American relief work and put surviving minority populations at greater risk. This argument prevailed over congressional support for a declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire. The Sublime Porte broke off diplomatic relations with the US in April 1917, but with the assistance from the Swedes, neutral America's philanthropy continued during the rest of the war. This was an astonishing example of private philanthropy's influence on American foreign policy. Barton would reverse his position against intervention by March 1918, but by then it was too late to influence events. Former President Teddy Roosevelt intensely hated Wilsonian neutrality, particularly when justified on humanitarian grounds. He countered that it would be better to go to war against the Ottoman Turks and eliminate the need for aid in the first place. In a 1918 letter to Cleveland Dodge that Dr. Gregorian brought to my attention, and it's been subsequently quoted by Samantha Power, Roosevelt argued, to allow the Turks to massacre the Armenians, and then to solicit permission to help the survivors, and then to allege the fact that we are helping the survivors as a reason why we should not follow the only policy that will put a stop to such massacres is both foolish and odious. For Roosevelt, Near East Relief's humanitarianism had become a misguided substitute for the intervention that would establish the basic security needed to achieve humanitarian goals. The philanthropic means had themselves become a barrier to achieving the ends they served. After the war, Woodrow Wilson advocated intervention in the context of grand plans for the League of Nations. Here, he points to Anatolian regions that he believed the August 1920 Treaty of Sèvres should add to the short-lived First Republic of Armenia. But Wilsonian Armenia never came to be. Wilson failed to gain United States Senate approval for an Armenian mandate for Armenia, American mandate for Armenia. French, British, Italian, and Greek forces retreated from Kemalist armies. Hope for an independent Armenian state in eastern Armenia died when the Soviet government started sending gold and weapons to support Kemalist revolutionaries. On November 29, 1920, the 11th Red Army advanced into the Republic of Armenia, which was then absorbed into Soviet Russia. So in the end, Uncle Sam never recruited soldiers for the Near East, and America's role remained philanthropic. Mabel Elliott dispensed aid under fire along the path of retreating Allied troops. Without basic security, America's ambition to build a new Near East was largely transformed during this period into a desperate mopping up operation. Having answered the call of AWH to help refugees in the Near East, Elliott began her work in Constantinople in April 1919 by providing medical care for Armenian girls who had been incorporated into Turkish homes during the genocide and then released on British orders. To reach them, she crossed the Bosphorus on what she described as a dingy ferry boat crowded with strangely clothed men and women chattering all the tongues of the Near East. She passed Near East and Red Cross relief boats such as these, some filled with refugees, others with supplies. And she floated under the imposing Selamia barracks on the Asian shore. Here, Florence Nightingale, who had died just 9 years before, had cared for wounded and sick soldiers during the Crimean War of 1853-6. In the nearby Scutari Rescue Home, Elliott examined and interviewed 150 well-educated girls about their wartime experiences. It was my first personal encounter, she wrote later, with the things that human beings can do carelessly without rancor, laughing to other human beings. The facts those girls told were like revelations of the mind of a madman. A report in the AWH archives contains results of medical examinations, Wasserman tests for syphilis, and personal histories. Sexual transmitted disease and other physical and mental injury are all present. Later that month, Elliott took 7 boxcars of medical supplies southeast on the Baghdad Railway, which was now guarded by a thin line of British troops. Arriving in Aleppo after 11 days of travel, she transferred to automobile for the last 150 miles north to the town of Marash. The roads were filled with refugees. She had arrived just 2 weeks after British troops, who were attempting to secure a foothold in a region that was, in fact, slipping out of their grasp. Sadly, the estimated 25,000 returning Cilician Armenians were also walking into a terrible trap. In Marash, Elliott took over operation of a German missionary hospital, pictured here in the center foreground. With an inherited staff and newly supplied storerooms and pharmacy, she began treating patients from a wide area, including mountain Kurds, Armenian fighters returning from Egypt, and many Muslim women. She was shocked by local medical practices, which she said were tantamount to torture for these women. In addition to her work in the hospital, an orphanage, and another rescue home for Armenian girls, Elliott solved supply transport problems by using camels instead of trucks. But ominous signs of outside trouble appeared. 2 American YMCA workers bringing movie equipment to Marash were murdered on the mountain road. And in September 1919, Lloyd George capitulated to Clemenceau's proposal to have the French assume control of Cilicia. Elliott and her Near East relief colleagues watched British troops hand power over to the French at nearby Ain Tab on November 4th, 1919. Within 2 months, Kemalist armies attacked Marash. As the nationalists charged down from the mountains in January 1920, Elliott found herself in the middle of the first major battle of the Turkish War of Independence. She kept the hospital operating during the winter siege amidst murder and gunfire. But Turkish forces overpowered the under-resourced French and their Armenian legionnaires. On the night of February 10th, 1920, barely a year after Elliott's arrival from America, the French unexpectedly retreated, leaving an estimated 10,000 only recently repatriated Armenians to a violent fate. Elliott, her nurses, and about 5,000 refugees, mainly women and children, endured a harrowing 3-day evacuation on foot over the Taurus Mountains in swirling snow that developed into a full blizzard. Only about half survived. A look at the mountains above Marash in winter provides a glimpse of what the 45-mile evacuation must have been like. Elliott wrote, "I do not know how many hours we had been walking when I found the first dead child on its mother's back. I walked beside her, examining it. She trudged on, bent under the weight, doggedly lifting one foot and then the other through the snow, blind and deaf to everything. The child was certainly dead, and she did not know it. The doctor saw about 10 dead children dropped in the snow by the moving column. In time, I too was a blind machine, moving forward, examining no more children. I thought of nothing, cared for nothing, simply struggled onward. Just in front of us was a cart. One of the women in it had died, and the body, caught by the feet, dragged in the snow. I saw it dragging in front of us for miles. I looked at it dully and avoided stepping on it." Elliott had, at least briefly, become a refugee herself. On hearing of the massacres at Marash, James Barton and Cleveland Dodge lobbied the State Department to send the U.S. Army to Cilicia and pushed harder for an American mandate over Armenia. A Near East relief pamphlet warned the U.S. Senate against being like Pontius Pilate and turning more Armenians over for crucifixion, all to no avail. Elliott recovered from this ordeal and took charge of general medical relief in the coastal town of Izmit near Constantinople. With Allied ships still in the harbor, she's pictured at the top there, and a staff of Armenian and American doctors, nurses, and pharmacists began to care for the thousands of Armenian and Greek refugees now pouring in from the Anatolian interior. In a 100-bed hospital, a clinic, a headquarters for fighting epidemic diseases, and 2 orphanages, Elliott treated refugees for a variety of ailments, starting with malnutrition. She examined this little boy, whose joints, she wrote, were diseased from starvation. Elliott established a children's hospital, pictured here, for the isolation and treatment of trachoma, the contagious and painful eye disease that, left untreated, can cause blindness. But Mustafa Kemal's troops were on the move again, and within 3 months, Elliott's Izmit operating room, pictured here, was also engulfed in war. The British pulled out of Izmit, leaving a weakened Greek army. Once more, Elliott wrote, bullets were zipping across our compound and striking into the plaster of the walls. Again, we put patients on the floor, out of range of the windows. By June 1921, the Greeks evacuated. 15,000 Greek and Armenian refugees now crowded the waterfront, seeking escape. Elliott ensured safe passage for these, her Armenian nurses in training, but she and her American nurses this time opted not to evacuate themselves. The battlefront had moved over us, Elliott wrote, and we were on the Turkish side. She delivered this Armenian woman's baby during the night of Izmit's recapture by the Turks, with houses burning in red flame, mixed with thick black smoke in the darkness. Here, Elliott and her colleague, Miss McLaren, stand behind the new baby and its mother, Marika, whose husband was dead and family fled. As she had in Marash, Elliott was now again caring for Muslim patients. The conditions in and around the hospital were difficult, including looting and rioting. She regretted that Turkification had expelled what she described as the whole small structure of civilization, previously staffed by Armenian and Greek bakers, carpenters, bookkeepers, plumbers, cooks, merchants, bankers, and more. This, she said, made it difficult to continue operations. The Near East Relief closed its Izmit hospital 10 months later. As the nationalists approached a showdown in Constantinople, near Constantinople, Elliott reported for her next assignment in Caucasian Armenia. In September 1921, Elliott took charge of Near East Relief medical work in Yerevan. By now, newly Sovietized Armenia had been ravaged by advances and retreats of Turkish and Russian forces, with lost harvests causing mass starvation. She was shocked by Armenian villages in ruins, scenes of destitution along the railways, and starving children such as this one on the right, waiting at the doors of hospitals. Working with 12 AWH doctors and other Near East staff, under the thumb of local Bolshevik officials, she began outfitting more hospitals and organizing sanitary squads to clean facilities. She wrote home, "There are hundreds of children still on the streets. We are feeding 1,000 of them we have no buildings for. 2 of them died in the bread line the other day." The boy pictured upper left was admitted to an American orphanage, but only 20 of the larger group below could be assisted. With winter approaching, Elliott wrote, "They are dying in all corners of the city. All day long you can hear the groans and wails of the little children outside. We are picking them up as fast as possible, but there's no use crowding them in so that they will all die." Then, in March 1922, Elliott's scope of work was expanded further to include the largest orphanage in the world in the city of Alexandropol, soon to be renamed after Lenin. Here, Near East Relief had transformed 3 former military posts into nothing less than cities of children. "We found the medical relief of 40,000 children on our hands," she wrote. "I mean this literally. There was not one healthy child among them." Elliott described the orphanages at Alexandropol as an adventure of American organization in the immemorial chaos of the Caucasus. She wrote, "It was a bit of modern America inserted between 2 chapters of the Old Testament. The wandering refugees led by Moses, the wars between Israelites and Philistines, the lost tribes in their dispersion, coming suddenly upon a gigantic American business organization which handled food and shelter and education and hospital care." Each of these children, Elliott wrote, has a human story of terror and flight, of murder and death, from exhaustion on refugee marches, of being lost and cold and hungry and sick. To care for these numbers required the soldier's daughter to exercise military-style organization and hygiene. First, rescued children were separated from their lice-filled clothes and hair, and then re-outfitted in clean clothes and provided with basic nutrition and strict meal rotations. Relief workers estimated to feed all the children at once in just one of the 3 Alexandropol posts would have required a table more than a mile long. Elliott wrote that they became symbols in card index systems, so many thousands of receptacles into which so many hundreds of pounds of corn grits and fats must be put in so many hours. There was no time, she wrote, to think of them as immature human beings. TB, meningitis, typhus, and cholera were rampant, so sick patients were graded and isolated by the scale of their disease. Trachoma was treated by rubbing inverted eyelids with copper sulfate pencils. "Did you ever realize how many 5,000 children are?" Elliott wrote home in April 1922. "I didn't until I saw them trooping by each day to the eye clinic to get their trachoma treatments. From before 8 in the morning until after 5 at night, there was one continuous stream of them going and coming to our number 2 hospital. It is an enormous job. And when I tell you the same thing is going on in 2 other posts, you may have an idea of what the AWH personnel is up against." Scalp and skin infections required malodorous prophylactic sulfur dips and head shavings. By July 1922, Elliott and her colleagues administered an average of 16,000 daily eye, scalp, scabies, surgical, and general medical treatments. 13,000 of these were for trachoma alone each day. A nurse's training program for older refugee girls and orphans provided help, or some might say forced labor. This was just one part of the Near East Relief's educational program, which focused on teaching orphans skills for future self-support. Boy Scout troops empowered older orphans to watch after younger ones. The sticks they wield in this photo suggest that their care may not have always been gentle or benign. And indeed, given the uncomfortable medical treatments, the strict exercise regimes, and Spartan living conditions, it's not surprising that many children, once admitted, didn't enjoy these orphanages very much. This is a theme explored by Chris Bajalian in his novel The Sandcastle Girls. And Nora Nersessian has discovered evidence in Armenian sources of harsh and even sadistic discipline on the part of Near East relief workers in Alexandropol's orphan cities. Finally, the winds of war blew again, and Elliott left Alexandropol for her last assignment. In September 1922, Kemalist forces reached the westernmost coast of Asia Minor. In retaliation for the Greek invasion of Anatolia, they burnt down much of the city of Smyrna, pictured here. In response, Elliott rushed to administer aid to refugees now in Greece, beginning with Rodosto, eastern Thrace, and the island of Mytilene. So, to review, Mustafa Kemal's armies, with Soviet assistance, had now expelled non-Turks and Near East Relief itself in three fundamental directions: to the south, the east, and the west. Having retreated from the southern circle with refugees from Cilicia, Elliott now left that eastern arc of Sovietized Armenia to return to the western arc, where 1.5 million Greek and Armenian refugees were fleeing lands where they too had lived for millennia. 500,000 Muslims would take refuge in the opposite direction under the January 1923 Lausanne Convention on Compulsory Population Exchange. In November 1922, Elliott, who's pictured here, was appointed medical director of Near East Relief in Greece. From this headquarters in Athens, she worked with AWH staff to establish 7 Near East Relief hospitals and numerous smaller clinics to treat refugees pouring out of Asia Minor. Refugee ships brought typhus, smallpox, and other health hazards to Greek shores. In January 1923, Elliott wrote that the conditions on these boats is beyond description. In the harbor, it is not permissible to throw overboard the dead, so there's nothing to do but burn the bodies in the ship's furnaces. For this purpose, chutes have been built, and as quickly as one dies, the remains are shoved down these chutes. Added to the rest of the stench, which always accompanies these ships of horror, is now added the distressing odor of burning flesh. The Greek government asked AWH to establish a quarantine station on Macaronese Island, and the women doctors, Elliott in her white hat, accepted the challenge. AWH Dr. Olga Stasny from Omaha took charge of organizing tented encampments with blankets in several clusters around the island, and a kitchen from which food was prepared and served from great vats to quarantined refugees waiting each day in long lines. American doctors and nurses managed this hospital and disinfecting station where refugee clothes were steamed and deloused to stop typhus. And in Athens, Elliott, who's pictured here again in her white hat, provided medical assistance for refugees and malnourished children, such as this little boy admitted to the Athens hospital. Or this 7-year-old girl who was scarcely bigger than a 2-year-old when Elliott cared for her. Once again, Near East Relief opened orphanages, which were filled to overflowing. Mabel Elliott's contract required her entire time, 7 days a week, full-time on all working days, to accept whatever work is assigned, to be ready to go wherever sent, and to adapt myself to whatever conditions of living that may be necessary. These, of course, included exposure to violence and much disease. Mabel Elliott's boss wrote that before going into the field, she was immunized against bubonic plague, cholera, diphtheria, meningitis, smallpox, and typhoid, and yet was still susceptible to malaria and typhus fever. Dr. Stastny's assistant died of typhus fever on Macaronese Island. AWH paid Elliott an annual salary of $2,500. That's worth under $35,000 today. This was the highest salary AWH had ever paid one of its doctors in relief service. Elliott was decorated 3 times by the Greek government for her services. Yet just 3 days before the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, she abruptly resigned from her post and returned to the US, where she joined the faculty of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. She was disappointed that AWH had tightened its management oversight, had refused her first ever request for a raise, and denied her permission to publish memoirs. Elliott left the region disillusioned with what she described as the accumulating disappointments of the peace. Although critical of the Ottoman Turks, she blamed British and French for cutting up living Turkey on a map and quarreling over loot of oil wells and railway routes and new territory. Today, the blood is on the Turks' bayonet, she wrote, but bloodstains are invisible on the signed pieces of paper, safe and clean in Downing Street or on the Quai d'Orsay. Elliott and Near East Relief colleagues like James Barton were ashamed and furious that Allied retreat and American neutrality had left Armenians to a horrible fate. They had failed to stop the killing and displacement. However, from 1923, these views were strangely suppressed. AWH silenced Elliott's critique of U.S. High Commissioner to Constantinople, Admiral Mark Bristol, who justified the State Department's policy of non-interference, partly by questioning Armenian credibility. AWH also literally covered up its own earlier condemnation of America's neutrality during the burning of Smyrna. The caption shown on the left originally read, "Relief House Smyrna during the Holocaust, American flag under which large number of people sought but did not find protection." This, as you see, was crossed out, and a new caption was placed on top of it, shown on the right. This new caption made no mention of the Holocaust or how American neutrality had denied anyone protection. James Barton, shown here in 1920 with an orphan from the town of Urfa, had strongly advocated an American mandate for Armenia. In 1922, he tried to have Bristol removed from office. To Barton, the Treaty of Lausanne was a moral disaster. Yet in his 1930 History of Near East Relief, he wrote that America had done the right thing not to assume the mandate, and that Bristol was a sympathetic ally. Elliott employed similar rationalizations in the memoirs that she published in 1924. She and Barton reasoned that humanitarianism had been a uniquely American, non-imperialist answer to the continuing Armenian tragedy. Near East Relief had become, in effect, America's unofficial mandate for Armenia. So in conclusion, Near East Relief expressed practical-minded American solutions to problems on an international scale. It relied on a vast and business-like office infrastructure, a complex distribution system, and financial savvy in times of wildly fluctuating exchange rates. It brought ambulances, tractors, grain, and a host of other tangible goods and services to populations in extreme distress. It rescued an estimated 132,000 orphans and gave them health and skills needed to build a new future. Barton estimated that by 1930 it had saved 1 million people in 2 generations in 11 countries on 3 continents. It had created a new generation of American internationalists, including amazing heroines like Mary Graffam and Mabel Elliott. Near East Relief brought the American flag and Boy Scout uniforms to the former Ottoman Empire. It promoted, where possible, the most progressive American methods of child welfare, public health, and practical education. It certainly had weaknesses. Despite providing much valuable assistance to Muslims, its very success in helping non-Muslim minorities may have inadvertently exacerbated the Ottoman Turkish reaction. In 1917, it stood in the way of humanitarian intervention in Asia Minor that might have helped the victims it sought to serve. After the war, its influential leaders were unable to translate generous American philanthropic support into real security for Armenians or other minorities. For this, perhaps, however, they shouldn't be entirely blamed. The story of Near East Relief exposed the inner contradictions of Wilsonianism during and after what this New York Times map called simply the War of the Races. The promotion of ethnic self-determination had unleashed a force that by the very act of claiming its rights had denied the same rights to others. Wilson's campaign for self-government of all peoples had found its tragic but logical answer in the burning of Smyrna and in the widespread ethnic cleansing that accompanied the implosion of the Ottoman Empire and other great multi-ethnic empires of this period. As it retreated from Asia Minor with Greeks, Armenians, Assyrians, and others, Near East Relief learned that philanthropy was no substitute for military force. Its services might comfort destitute Armenian children such as these, but despite a surprising amount of political influence, it could not stop the deportations and killings. The subsequent history of the 20th century has demonstrated that soldiers, not aid workers, stop genocide and ethnic cleansing. It's also shown that aid can sometimes paradoxically prolong the very suffering it seeks to alleviate. The organization Médecins Sans Frontières opted to withdraw from select refugee camps after the 1994 Rwandan genocide because of such concerns. Despite good intentions, Near East Relief may have also inadvertently worsened some outcomes for the victims it sought to help. These orphans lined up in Alexandropol to thank America for saving them from destitution and death. But perhaps more lives would have been saved if Near East Relief hadn't either won its argument for neutrality in 1917 or lost its argument for intervention in 1919 and 20. Perhaps not. We'll never know for sure. Both Roosevelt's progressive imperialism and Wilson's liberal internationalism ultimately had such inconsistent or weak political support at home that neither approach was ever tested in the real fires of the Armenian Crucible. In the end, despite the aspirational title of its monthly journal, The New Near East, America's humanitarian effort failed to build a new society based on progressive American reforms in former Ottoman lands. It did, however, help to ensure the survival of the Armenian and other diasporas. This 1922 issue cover featured a photo of a recently dedicated statue of George Washington leading troops to victory at the Battle of Princeton. Beneath the photo, it quoted the general saying, "Happy, thrice happy shall they be, who have assisted in protecting the rights of human nature and establishing an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions." By rescuing desperate people from dangerous and harmful situations and by providing them with opportunities to start again on safer shores, Near East Relief possibly discovered its own, and indeed American philanthropy's, most successful vocation. Thank you sincerely for your attention today.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.